All right, so for the last 3 weeks, we have been looking at and talking about what we're doing next as a church. And I've shared with you, reminded you what our vision is, to glorify God as an effective and influential church. And we've gone through all sorts of things. And if you've missed any of the last 3 weeks, I highly encourage you, especially if you're like, hey, friendship is home for me, or we're considering making friendship our home, I highly encourage you, in fact, almost like command, you subliminal there, to get online and watch those and listen to those, because it'll help you understand the heart, the passion, the direction of where we're going. So what I want to do is I just want to really quickly this morning, as we begin, do a quick recap, okay? We've talked about the fact that over the last 20 years, our society, our world, has had some pretty significant cultural and societal shifts that have taken place. And there was a slow, gradual shift that was taking place in a lot of different areas. And then over the last 3 years, with the pandemic and shutdowns and all these different things, all those shifts that were taking place kind of more gradually became exponentially sped up. And so a lot of transitional things have taken place. And I mean, my goodness, who'd have thought, like seriously, those of you that are over the age of 30, who would have thought 10 years ago that you could pick up your phone and order food from any restaurant in the world and it would show up at your door for a nominal fee of $7.95, right? I mean, it's crazy to think about those things, but all that stuff has been accelerated, and engagement online and all those different things have taken place. But one of the things, unfortunately, that's happened, and that only has been accelerated through this, is that as a society, we have increasingly become less and less engaged when it comes to church as a whole. And I share with you two really crazy statistics. The first one is that 6,000 to 10,000 churches close the doors every single year. And let me just put that down. I like to put cookies on the lower shelf because, first of all, I like cookies. But like literally, I want everyone to be able to get it in a way they understand. That means, folks, that since the beginning of this series, there's been between 400 and 800 churches that have closed their doors. Now think about that. That is a scary, overwhelming thing. Now let's be real. Some of those churches probably needed to close their doors, right? Some things just should die sometimes. It's kind of like some of the old restaurants. You're like, man, I wish that old restaurant was still around. And we're like, well, after the 700th salmonella case, it was time to shut that restaurant down. But the reality is that just, a lot have lost the ability to engage. Then this next one, which is really more damning than this one, is that the median church size just a little bit over 20 years ago was 137. And in 2020, it was 65 people. That was more than cut in half. And so literally, as we look at those things, we realize that as a society, we are becoming less and less engaged in church. Now, we, as human beings, and especially as Americans, we love to blame other people for the things that are going on in our lives. You're like, no, we don't. You have not paid attention to social media over the last 36 hours. It is everybody else's fault, right? We have to blame everybody else. And so reality, we could blame our world, and we could say how horrible and how terrible our world is. And I do find it interesting that the older we get, the more it's the young people's fault. Can you ever realize that? When you were a young person, it was never your fault. It was the old people's fault. But as you get older, it's the young people's fault. It's just this amazing thing because we love to blame people. We love to look around and point the finger at somebody else. And so we go, hey, the world, it's the world's problem, right? It's so bad. It's so, not conducive to Christianity. And then, everybody gets all fired up because some city government official somewhere tries to say that Christians are basically, of the devil or something like that. Oh, we're going to do petitions. Folks, do you realize that the Church of Jesus Christ was planted when Nero was emperor? And you go, well, yeah, he wasn't that good. No. He wasn't just not good. He literally would take Christians, wrap them in cloth, dip them in oil while they were still alive, put them on a stake in his garden, and light them on fire for his garden at night. Now, I'm not aware of it. And if you're like, hey, Dave, I know, you can text me. I'm not aware of a world leader that's currently doing that. So that means our society really isn't as bad as it was when the whole thing began. Yeah, it would be simpler to blame other people and to say, you know what? Those other people, isn't it amazing? You're never part of the other people, are you? I'm never a part of the other people. It's always somebody else. The other people who have overloaded their lives with schedules, right? They've overloaded their lives. Listen, they're taking their kids everywhere. I mean, they're taking them to soccer practice and baseball practice and frisbee practice and golf practice and cheer practice and football practice and I don't know what other practice. I mean, it's just crazy. They have just overloaded their lives so much that they have planned God right out of their lives. I sound like I should be in a rocking chair on top of a deck, right? But you know, when the church was young, when the church first started, do you realize that the vast majority, well over half of the people that called church and church home were slaves. And they were at the beck and call of their masters 24/7, but yet they still found time to show up and worship and be the hands and the feet of Jesus Christ. Sure, we could try to blame our favorite thing, right? Especially if you're conservative, right? If you're conservative politically, the problem with everything in the world is who? It's the government, the man. The government has done it to us. So we can blame the government. Or maybe, it's the education system, right? Those education system people, I tell you what, they're horrible. Or even better, it's Hollywood. Hollywood, daggone it. They haven't made a good Christian movie. Well, I'm pretty sure that's not part of their plan. You see, it's easy to blame everyone and everything else. And let's be honest, none of those things are helping, right? They're not like, let's help you do what you're supposed to be doing. But the reality is that they're not really the culprits either. The truth is, the reason that the Big C church, right? The Big C church and churches as a whole are declining in their influence and their effectiveness is because as a whole, we have become complacent over innovative. We have become predictable instead of exciting. We've become safe instead of adventurous. Now, I am a sucker for a good meme. Anyone else here just love a really good, well-done meme? Like you just chuckle. One of my favorite ones that I have seen recently is a picture of a little kid and a picture of like a grown adult. And it says, if my 5-year-old self saw my 30-year-old self, it would kick my butt. Have you seen that? Like you think about that, it's like you think about your hopes and dreams when you were younger and the things that you've given up, you've sacrificed, you've compromised on to be able to just be who you are today. And you're like, man, if my 5-year-old self saw my 30-year-old self, it would kick my butt. Well, I think it would be safe to say the same thing. If the first century church saw the 21st century church, they would kick our butts. They'd be like, what is wrong with y'all? You have everything available and accessible to you, and yet you're coming up with all sorts of excuses as to why you're not being and doing the church the way you're supposed to. By the way, I want you to be real. Some of you are looking at me like, man, Dave's mad at us. No, not at all. This is like an us thing, okay? This is like the church as a whole thing. I'm not like, you losers, you dirt fleas. No, not at all. This is literally just going, this is where we are. This is just being honest with where we are. And even us as a church, and as a church at Friendship, we love to say that phrase, right? That we believe that the church should be fun and relevant and never waste your time. And the reason that is something that we've keyed in on is because of these things. But even we as a church oftentimes will choose the safe route instead of the adventurous route, the complacent route instead of the innovative route. Because it's just easier to do that, is it not? Can we not agree that it's just easier to do that? And that's why we see what we see today in people not engaging in the church. But through all of this, God has given us a really cool opportunity. And I shared this with you just either last week or the week before, I can't remember. But when we look at the statistics and people's willingness to engage with God and interest in spiritual things
It's actually the highest that it's been in multiple decades. In fact, the statistics tell us that people who are willing, let's go to that next slide, people that are, one more. There we go. People that are willing to actually believe in God has risen by multiple points, 77%. People who said, I'd like to grow spiritually, 74%. People that say, I'm more spiritually open today than I was pre-COVID. So of all the stuff that we really grumble about, and I'm with you, I'm like, don't be like, Dave doesn't grumble about COVID. Dave, you've not had a conversation with me because I got to ask for forgiveness a lot when that comes up. But the reality is that one of the things that it's done is it's allowed people to see things in a different light. And what's amazing is that as we look at our society, our community, and as we are exponentially growing, and I've shared those things with you, I'm not going to go over those with you again, we realize that our community is disproportionately made up of one segment of society. And there's more in this age group than any other age group. In fact, I'm going to say this, I may be not 100% right, but I think it's pretty close. And that is that this age group is more than all the other age groups combined. And it's the millennial age group. Now, the millennial age group, if you're like, oh, those young whippersnappers, okay, millennials are 26 to 41. So you're like, oh. So if you are, let me just really quickly, if you are in that age group, if you are ages 26 to 41, and by the way, ladies, you can go, yeah, I'm 28. That's fine. We don't care if you're 41. That's fine. But if you're in that age group, that 26 to 41, let me just see your hands real quick. Just take a look around you, okay? It's not, Debbie, you are not at heart. Okay. Right? Now think about that for a second. That is the age group that a lot of people, they poo-poo on. But here's the reality. I mean, I'm a Gen Xer. You know, the baby boomers hated us, and we hated them. And that's just the way that it was, right? But millennials, if we understand that, and we ask the question, we're like, okay, so what is it that they believe their most significant need is? And that's when we came across this study from the Cigna Health Group, and I want you to see this quote. They're the most connected, but at the same time, the loneliest generation. They long for genuine connection, yet they are terrified to reach out for fear of rejection, so they remain passively disconnected. Now, when we say we want to help people get connected, we kind of take our vision and we connect it with this, and this is how we've been talking about it for the last 3 weeks, and that is that being an effective and influential church means we need to connect the disconnected. Now, I know some of you that are like, I'm 42, so you don't care about me, huh? No, it's not. But you have to have a target that you shoot at, and so we shoot at the largest grouping of that target, and that just happens to be the millennials. And of course, the millennials are going, oh, you're shooting at us. I see how you are. Okay. But here's the thing that I think is really important for us to understand. When we use that word disconnected, this is what we mean. We define disconnected in 3 specific groups. They're those that are unchurched. They've never been actively engaged in church before in their life. And there are people in your life that you know that that's the way they are. There are people that are de-churched. This is probably, I'm going to go out on a limb here and say this is probably the largest group in millennials. Mommy and daddy took them to church. When they got old enough to no longer go to church, they're like, this is a waste of my time. And they stopped going to church. So they're de-churched. It's kind of like they got enough church in them. It's like the antibiotic, right? I don't need that anymore. Until they start having kids, the things begin to change there. And then there's the last one, they're hurt by church. And there's a healthy segment in this group as well, that they were engaged at some point in time somewhere, and something happened that really burned them. Now, before we move on, I want you to pause for just a minute in your minds. And I want you to think about the people in your life that fit into one of these categories. Because every one of us, every single person here, has people in their lives that fit into one of these categories. But we never stop and think about it. And so that's what we're doing today. Because these are the people that are disconnected. They don't have the most important relationship that's going to give them a sense of purpose and a sense of fulfillment, a sense of joy, a sense of meaning of life. Something that gives them the ability to go through stuff and come out the other end better. There's the disconnection there. So I want you intentionally, as we continue to talk for the rest of the day, to keep these people on your internal Rolodex, your internal contact sheet, because that's who we're talking about. That's who we as a church want to connect with. And the first thing we talked about was that if we as a church are going to do it, it begins in our homes. It begins in our lives. We talked about 4 specific habits that each and every one of us need to begin to put into practice in our lives. And those 4 habits are to worship fully. And we talked about that as we engage here as a church, we worship fully. Sometimes it's a sacrifice. Listen, you talk about transparent. Everyone's like, oh, you're so real. Let me be really real with you today. The last thing I wanted to do was come up here and preach this morning. Do you know why? I had a really interesting week. Anybody else have a really interesting week? A really fantastic couple of days? You're like, nope, I'm not interested whatsoever. But you know what? You get up and you do it. Why? Because God's worth it. He's worthy of our praise. He's worthy of our worship. And so we do it. And sometimes that's a sacrifice. And we talk about the fact that worshiping fully isn't just here on Sunday mornings. It's how we live our lives. When we spend time in the Word of God, we spend time listening, we spend time in prayer, that's worshiping fully, both personally and corporately. And then we talked about serving regularly, finding where you fit, using your abilities and your talents to serve other people, because that's the greatest expression of love that we can to give generously, to have a generous heart, to be able and willing to give of what God has blessed you with, to be able to bless others, and then invite continually. That we're always on the lookout for someone who's disconnected, who needs to connect to Jesus Christ. And so we're constantly inviting and encouraging people to come and being able to do that. And then last week we talked about as a church what we're going to do. We talked about 3 different groupings. We talked about how we group kind of everyone in our community in 3 groupings. There's the community, which is kind of everybody. There's the crowd, which is that's who you are right here. And then there's the church, those who have accepted Jesus Christ. And they said, yeah, this vision is my vision. This passion is my passion. This mission is my mission. This goal is my goal. And they're a part of what's going on here. And that as a church, what our goal is to come alongside and engage with our community, inspire the crowd to grow and understand who Jesus Christ is, and equip the church to become all that God has called them to be able to be spiritually deeper, financially stable, and relationally satisfied. And so that's the process. That's how we work through that. Now I want to share with you a number, okay? Let's just show that number really quickly. 75,300. Anyone know what that number is? Anyone want to take a guess? If you're a leader and you already know, don't say that, because I already told you that's cheating. Anyone have a guess what that number is? 75,300. You're like, that's my credit score. Nope. That's what I have in my bank account. Let's have a conversation. 75,300. You know what that is? That is the estimated total population of 2023 for Greenwood, Whiteland, and New Whiteland. Now, that doesn't include Franklin. Those of you that live in Franklin are like, well, they don't love me. No. Again, you got to focus on something. And this is our immediate community. These are all people that live about 5 minutes to 7 minutes from this location right here. 75,300. Now, that's a pretty significant population size. Now, I'm a goal setter. Anybody else here a goal setter? Just be like, yeah, right? Goal setters. Then those of you that are not goal setters are like, we hate you. And the reality is, if you're married and your spouse is a goal setter, you are not. And you stress them out when you set goals and when you talk about things and when you do things. It's like, just let life be. But I'm a goal setter. And you're like, why are you a goal setter? Here's why I'm a goal setter. Because if you set a goal, right, and you realize that's the goal that you're setting, even if you don't make that goal, even if you don't get to that goal, you are closer to that goal than you were if you hadn't set the goal because you tried to move towards that goal. So even if you fail at reaching your goal, you still have moved closer to the goal that you were trying to achieve. Does that make sense? Do you understand what I'm saying? In other words, if you go, I'm going to run a marathon, and I'm like, okay, I don't know why. I'm pretty sure Jesus gave us cars, but whatever. And you start running the marathon, and you make it like 1/23 of it. I think that's like 1 mile, right? You're like, you know what? You ran more of a marathon than I did because you moved in that direction. That's what goals do. They keep your eyes focused. So here is what we're talking about, because when I set goals, especially for us as a church, I like to set what I call bhags. And you're like, that is not a kind word. I'm pretty sure that you're going to get canceled if you use that word bhag again. Bhag. Bhag. Here's what the word means. Bhag. Big, hairy, audacious goal. I like that. It gives you a word picture, doesn't it? It's like you see this individual that's got they're just big, and I even kind of throw it off when I'm talking personally. I say big, hairy, wart-ridden, audacious goal, right? But that you can't say bhag. It doesn't go as well. But bhag. So here is the bhag I'm laying out for us as a church, and that is this: to be able to connect with 5% of our community. 5% of our community. Now, some of you are like, gosh, Dave, I thought you had me convinced that you were actually going to do some big, hairy, audacious goal. I mean, that's not very big. That's not very hairy. That's not very audacious. I mean, that's like military hairstyle right there. That's barely anything. In fact, quite frankly, Dave, I think you might be being a little bit of a wuss. Okay, well, before you get too far down that track, let me actually show you what 5% of our community actually is. 5% of our community is 3,765 people. Now, those of you that were just calling me a wuss are like, are you nuts? Were you dropped on your head as a child? Did your parents not love you? Right? Because you get that point. But here's the thing. 5% of our community engaging and connecting with these people and doing that is, well, that's a big, hairy, and audacious goal. Can we agree that that is a big, hairy, audacious goal? That's a bhag. Listen, use that word all this week and just wait to see what people do, okay? Bhag. Are you calling me a hag? Listen, if you're a hag, whatever. Y'all are naughty. That is not... Get your mind out of the gutters. Okay. Now, to be really honest with you, to be really just fully 100% transparent with no opacity whatsoever, there is nothing that we can do that's going to make that happen. There's not. No amount of planning, no amount of strategy, no amount of networking, no amount of events or anything that we do. Even if we do our plan perfectly, nothing we do is going to make that a reality. Because even if we've got the perfect marketing, it's not going to even get us close to 3,765 people as a part of friendship. I just don't believe it. But here's what I do believe. I do believe that Jesus died for you and for me and for everyone in this whole world, and that his death broke the power of sin. In Romans chapter 5, verses 6 and 8, it says, "For while we were still helpless," and by the way, helpless is each and every one of us. Because apart from God, we can do nothing. For while we were still helpless, at the appointed moment, Christ died for the ungodly. And by the way, you and I are also the ungodly. Because anyone that's not God or without God is, by definition, ungodly. You go, well, I'm not a bad person. You may not be a bad person, but you are ungodly. Because you are not God and you're not connected with God. Now, if you are connected with God, then you have the ability through Jesus Christ to be a godly individual. But at this point in time, we are all helpless and we are all ungodly. And then verse 8 says, but God proves His own love for us in that while we were still sinners. Paul is really laying it on here, isn't he? You're helpless, you're ungodly, and you're sinners. Don't you feel just the Spirit lifting off of your shoulders at this point in time? But what Paul is saying is, listen, it's not about you. You didn't do anything. Jesus did it all. While we were still sinners, Christ died for us. So I believe in Jesus. And I believe that 3 days later He rose again and His resurrection power shattered the chains of death. And so His death shattered the chains of sin. His resurrection shattered the chains of death. And that same resurrection power that rose Christ from the dead is now working in each and every one of us who knows Jesus and is following Him. Ephesians chapter 1. I also pray that you will understand the incredible greatness of God's power for us who believe in Him. This is the what? What's the next word? Same. Not different, not a smaller version of, not a condensed version, not a fraction of. It's the same power that raised Christ from the dead and seated Him at the place of honor at God's right hand in the heavenly realms. Now He is far above any ruler or authority or power or leader or anything else, not only in this world but also in the world to come. God has put all things under the authority of Jesus Christ and has made Him head over all things for the benefit of the who? You connect that? The same power that rose Christ from the dead courses through your veins if you know Jesus Christ. And God made Jesus Christ the head of over all things. And He did this, why? For your benefit. Because if you know Jesus Christ, you're the church. And the church has a mission and a vision that God has called us to carry out. In fact, I believe that this power actually enables us to carry out to completion the building of the type of church that Jesus spoke into existence in the book of Matthew, chapter 16, when He said, I will build my church, and the gates of hell shall not prevail against it. And I will give you the keys of the kingdom of heaven, and whatever you bind on earth will be bound in heaven, and whatever you loose on earth shall be loosed in heaven. So Jesus died for all of us. We believe that. Jesus rose from the dead, conquering death. And then He gifted us that same power that rose Him from the dead so that we can be the church. And then Jesus laid out this unbelievable, earth-shattering mission of the church, that He was going to build the church and even the gates of hell could not stand against it. And that as the church, whatever we bound, whatever we said, no, we are not going to allow that to become reality. God says, I will bind it in heaven as you've bound it there. And whatever we turn loose and we say, God, we ask that you would make this a reality, that you would speak this into existence because you are the Almighty God. God says, I will do that on your behalf. Now that is power. Can we agree? So when we take these three things together, here's what we see. We have the best news the world has ever heard. Think about that for a minute. Think about the best news you've ever gotten in your life. It could be when you asked your wife to say, would you marry me? And she goes, I will. And you're like, oh, good, because I was so freaked out you're going to say no. Or maybe it's when you got the news that you were pregnant as a family. You're like, oh, I'm so excited. Or when your baby was first born. Or you got the job. Or, hey, you know what? You're not fired. You're actually getting promoted. That's why I called you in. Whatever the best news you could ever imagine that you have received up to this point in time, it doesn't just pale in comparison. As the Apostle Paul talks about his works of righteousness, he says, it's like garbage in comparison to the unbelievable news that we have in Jesus Christ. You say, what is that news? The news is that each and every one of us are born sinners separated from God and are going to end up when we leave this life in a very real place called hell, forever separated from God. But God loves you so very much that he sent his own very son to die on the cross to pay for your sins so that not only do you not have to go there when you die, but you can have salvation today, freedom today, the power to live the way that God has called you to live today, right now. How great is that? It's the best news the world has ever heard, and it's ours to share. But that news isn't just the news. That news is backed by the greatest power that the universe has ever experienced. Now, we've seen a lot of powerful things. In fact, living in Indiana, you tend to see a lot of powerful things when the storms come through. We've seen a lot of powerful things over the last 36 hours, have we not? You're like, whoa. You look at the pictures and you see like this 50-foot wide swath, and you're like, wow, what power. That's not power when compared to the power of raising somebody from the dead. Now that's impressive. Listen, if you went into the morgue and you were like, come back to life, and everyone came back to life, do you think that might make the front page of the newspaper? It might be on Wikipedia for the rest of your life, even though it's going to probably have your name spelled wrong because it's Wikipedia. But it'll be on every news site, every news channel. You'd be interviewed by everyone in the world. You'd be called a witch, a crazy person, all these different things. But you know what? Even that pales in comparison, because do you know who raised Christ from the dead? Jesus Christ raised Christ from the dead. Now that's power. His body was dead, lifeless, no pulse, no nothing, had been dead for 3 days. And without any external power, he goes, I think I'm done with this. That's power. And that's the power that the best message that the world has ever heard is backed by. And it doesn't end there. It's like this great, wonderful infomercials at night, right? But wait, there's more. We have the best message that the world's ever heard, the greatest power that has ever been experienced, and we are inspired by the biggest vision that's ever been cast. It doesn't matter how big of a vision we cast here. It's going to pale in comparison to the vision that Jesus Christ cast for the church when he said, my church will break through anything that hell tries to put in its way. And I love that verse because often we read it and it's like, oh yeah, hell can't break into our kingdom. You're reading it wrong. The gates of hell. What has gates? A building, a castle, a fortified position. Jesus was not calling the church a fortress where people who love Jesus can come in and just hang together and love each other, and the world can't get us. He called the church an invading army that would knock down every single obstacle that hell could put in its way. Now, that's a pretty awe-inspiring vision, is it not? In fact, if that clip were on a movie, I'm pretty sure it would be in a locker room. And Coach Jesus would be like, all right, guys, here's what we're going to do. Now, when I look at those truths, my mind changes. It changes from thinking, how in the world could we ever do that? I mean, honestly, 3,765 people, are you out of your ever-loving mind? I mean, that is just absolutely insane, ridiculous, never going to happen. But when I look at those three truths, I think to myself, and I look at that, and then I think, what in the world could ever stop us from doing that if those three things are true? There's no better news. There's no greater power. And there's no more inspiring vision than what Jesus has to offer. If it's ever going to become reality, it will become reality because of those three things. But let's be honest. It's still overwhelming, isn't it? Can we be honest? Do you look at that and go, I don't think I like that many people. Okay, it's not about you. Remember that, okay? I don't think I want to. I mean, can you imagine the parking? Okay, just chill out for just a second. We're going to break it down just into our first step, okay? Just step number one. Because I love big picture things, but I know that it stresses out Tracy because that's not her thing. And I know that some of you are just like that, and so you're sitting there going, so we'll just, okay, here we go. The first step is that we want to connect with 0.5% in the next 3 to 5 years. Now, 0.5%, if we were to say that another way, it would be what? 1/2 of? Now, can we all agree that 0.5% is not an overwhelming figure? Anyone getting the heebie-jeebies or the hives over that? That's pretty chill, right? 0.5%. That's not overwhelming. That's not crazy. That's not something that we get overwhelmed with. We are currently averaging around 170 to 180. So if 0.5% is 350, 360, then all we need to do is double in size over the next 3 to 5 years. Now, for some of you, you're like, oh, double in size. Some of you have been here long enough to know that we've not only been here before, we've been here for years before. This is not something we've not seen. We've been here before. This is not some crazy, ridiculous thing that we're thinking about. But for those of you that are still a little stressed out, let's break it down into even a smaller step. So we'll break it down just a little bit more. We'll go to the next slide here. Let's break it down to these things. So here's what we're going to do. Over the next 3 to 5 years, step number 1A, okay? So step 1 is 0.5%. Here's step 1A. You're like, okay, before everything else, here's what we need to actually break 200 consistently, all right? Like, that's 20 more people. 20 more people. I passed 20 people in the drive-thru at Hardee's on the way here this morning. If you all love Hardee's for breakfast, we need to have a conversation. Just saying. So you're like, oh, but you've never had it. Yeah, because I don't want to sit in the bathroom the rest of the day. So I got things to do. But break 200 consistently. That's it. That's the simple first step, right? And then once we did that, we go, okay, grow above 200. Then we launch our second service. And you're like, 2 services? We've been there before. This is old hat for a lot of us. In fact, the cool part is when you do 2 services, you can serve in one and worship in the other, and you don't miss a thing. It's cool to actually see that happen. It's cool to be able to do that. And without building another piece of property, without putting any more pavement down, without hiring any more staff, we can double in size without having to do any of that because we simply do a second service. And then, number 4, we reach our 0.5% or 365 people. All right, there you go. Broken down. Simple, easy peasy. No problem. Easy. We can do that, right? Cool. But you know what? I think we can even break it down simpler than that. So you're like, oh, thank you, because that stressed me out too. Do you remember earlier when I asked you to think about those in your life who are disconnected? Those of you that just said thank you, I'm glad you did that, are like, oh, crap, I know where he's going now. Do you remember those people? Maybe your mind immediately came up with, 3, 4, 5 or so people. Others of you, you're like, man, I've got 15 to 20. But right now, here's what I want you to do. I want you to eliminate every single one of them except for one. Just right now in your mind, I want you to think of one person in your life that is disconnected. They're unchurched, they're de-churched, they're hurt by church. Just one. Do you have it? If you've got that person in your mind, just say, yep. I want you to think about that person. Now, if each and every one of us committed over the next 3 to 5 years to just simply connect that one person, do you realize that accomplishes step number one. I would love to say let's get simpler than that, but I don't think I can because we can't deal in half people. That, folks, is as simple as it gets. And you know what? That's really what it's all been about from the very beginning of time. That's really what it all boils down to. And I'm going to tell you a secret. Don't tell anybody else. This is just for us. If you're watching online, just pause for a moment. They don't get that because they didn't bother showing up. So I'm teasing. I actually believe if we do that, it's not going to be 3 to 5 years. It's going to be more like 2. But that's just for us. Don't tell anybody else, okay? That's what I think. But the goal is 3 to 5 years. Now, you might push back. You might go, oh, but Dave, I'm not a people person. Trust me, we all know. But I want to remind you of something. You may not be a people person, but you are the church. And your personality doesn't preclude you from accomplishing your mission. You have been given the best news that your one person will ever hear in their life. And your message, that's the best message your one person will ever hear, is backed by the greatest power that the universe has ever experienced. And you, whether you like it or not, are a part of accomplishing the biggest vision that has ever been cast. So who's your one? Who's your one? Who's the one person whose life you're going to change this week by inviting them to experience Easter with you? So you're not inviting them to a building. You're not inviting them to a place. You're not even really inviting them to a service. You're inviting them to connect with you. Because being an effective and influential church means connecting the disconnected. Father, we have been overwhelmingly blessed if we know Jesus Christ. There is no greater message that has ever been spoken. And God, if we know Jesus Christ, we are the ambassadors. We're the teachers, the preachers, the prophets, the communicators, the displayers of that message. We are the message bearers. You've placed it within us, but not for us, but to share it with others. And God, it's terrifying. It is terrifying to think about the potential of someone rejecting the message because, God, we take it personally. We think they're rejecting us. And so, help us be reminded that we are backed by the greatest power the universe has ever experienced. And God, remind us that it's not just us by ourselves, all out in the wilderness hoping to find. But God, as the writer of Hebrews says, we are surrounded by a great cloud of witnesses. We are surrounded by a grouping of people. We are a part of something bigger and more magnificent and more glorious than anything that we have ever experienced, as we are a part of the church. and that what you're doing in us is making an impact in the church, and that church that you have established that has lasted for over 2,000 years, it will survive, and it will grow, and it will reach until the day that you call us home, because that is what you've established to be true. And so instead of somebody on the outside looking in, hoping that somebody does it, God, I pray that we stand on our own 2 feet and we say, God, here I am. Here I am. Like the prophet of old, when God, you said, who can I send? And he stood up and he said, here am I, send me. God, let that be our cry. Here am I, God, send me to that one. I know I've got a vast crowd of disconnected around me, but God, I'm thinking of that one person. And God, I pray that that one person would hear the greatest message that's ever been spoken. They'd hear it from me. And that, God, the power that is unbelievable and unfettered would flow through me to be able to communicate it in a way that they would respond. And that, God, they then would be a part of the greatest vision that's ever been cast as they connect to Jesus Christ and they grow in you. Father, I pray as we close this morning, we respond with worship, especially as we sing this song about the resurrection power that is in us. God, I pray that we would just sense and feel and be enveloped by the energy and the truth of who you are, and it would cause us to move and be all you've called us to be. So God, I thank you for that. And I pray this in the power of the name of Jesus Christ. Amen. Let's stand and let's